The knock came at dusk, and Celia Grady's heart stopped dead in her chest before her hand even reached the door handle. She had been expecting it, in the way that a person expects a storm when the sky turns that particular shade of greenish-gray, not wanting it to come, praying against it, but knowing deep in the marrow of their bones that it is already on its way. Her brother Emmett had ridden out 3 days ago with the cattle drive toward Abilene, and the trail was dangerous this time of year. She had warned him. She had stood on the porch of the small homestead she shared with him on the outskirts of Dusty Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and she had gripped his sleeve and told him to be careful. He had laughed, the way Emmett always laughed, like the world was a game and he had already won it. The knock came again, firmer this time, and Celia pressed her palm flat against the wood of the door and breathed. "Just a moment," she called, and her voice cracked on the last word. She wiped her hands on her apron. She smoothed her dark hair back from her face. She told herself it could be anyone. It could be old Mrs. Albrecht from the next property over, coming to borrow flour again. It could be the postmaster's boy delivering a letter from her cousin in Missouri. It could be anyone at all. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was not old Mrs. Albrecht, and he was not the postmaster's boy. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dusty brown hat that had seen too many seasons and a canvas duster that was just slightly too big for him in a way that made him look like he had inherited it from someone larger and meaner. His boots were caked with red Kansas clay. His jaw was covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, and his eyes, she noticed his eyes first. She would always say that afterward. She noticed those eyes before anything else were the color of worn copper, warm and brown with little flecks of gold in them, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. In one hand, he held his hat, which he had pulled from his head as she opened the door. In the other hand, pressed somewhat awkwardly against the front of his duster, he held a fistful of wildflowers. They were the kind that grew along the creek bank just east of town, purple clover blossoms, bright yellow black-eyed Susans, a few sprays of white yarrow, the stems already drooping a little from being held in a large, work-roughened hand for what was probably quite some time. They were a messy, cheerful, entirely impractical bouquet, and they were the last thing on earth she had expected to see. Celia Grady stared at the wildflowers for a full 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds every terrible thought she had been holding in her chest simply fell apart. The man cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and a little rough at the edges, like a road that had been traveled hard. "My name is Gilbert Fletcher. I ride for the Donahue outfit. I apologize for coming at this hour. I wasn't entirely sure of the proper time to—" He stopped. He looked down at the flowers in his hand and then back up at her, and something shifted in his expression that she would later describe as the look of a man who has just realized he has walked into a room and forgotten entirely why he came. "I had reason to call on you," he said more firmly this time. "I have news about Emmett Grady." There it was. There was the storm. Celia's hand tightened on the door frame. "Is he dead?" She asked, and she was proud of herself for how steady her voice was when she said it. Gilbert Fletcher blinked. "No, ma'am. No, he is not dead. He is—" He paused, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. "He is fine. He asked me to bring you those flowers, actually. He said you liked black-eyed Susans. He said to tell you not to worry because he knew you were worrying." He held the bouquet out toward her, a little stiffly, like a man who is more comfortable with ropes and saddles than with wildflowers. "He also said to tell you that the drive is going well, that they made good time to the Cimarron crossing, and that he expects to be back before the end of June." Celia looked at the flowers. Then she looked at Gilbert Fletcher. Then she looked at the flowers again. "He sent you all the way from the Cimarron crossing," she said slowly, "to bring me flowers. He did. He sent a grown man on a horse to deliver me a message that he is fine and some flowers." "Yes, ma'am." "That is," she said, and she felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound very tight for 3 days, and it came loose all at once in a rush of something that was half laughter and half tears, the most like Emmett thing I have ever heard in my life. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, breathing through the surge of relief that rolled through her like a river coming over its banks after a long rain. Then she straightened, and she reached out and took the wildflowers from his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," she said. "I am sorry I kept you waiting. Would you like to come in? I have coffee on the stove, and I suspect you have ridden a fair distance today." He had, as it turned out, ridden nearly 40 miles. She learned this as she poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set them on the small wooden table in the kitchen, and as he settled himself into the chair across from her with the careful manner of a man who is aware that he is a large person in a small space and is trying very hard not to knock anything over. He was 28 years old. He had been working cattle since he was 16, had come up from Texas with the Donahue outfit 4 years ago when the drive route started pushing through Kansas, and had stayed because, as he said with a shrug, Kansas suited him well enough. He was not, she gathered, a man who talked a great deal for the pleasure of it, but he answered her questions directly and without any of the false modesty or excessive charm that she had learned to be wary of in men who came around single women living alone. She was 24. She had been living on this homestead with Emmett for 2 years, since their mother passed in Missouri and left them the small savings she had kept in a tin box under the floorboards, enough to stake a land claim and buy a few head of cattle and some seed, not enough for much else. She told him this in the way that she told most people, matter-of-factly, without apology, and he listened in the way that she would come to understand was characteristic of Gilbert Fletcher, which was to say with his full and complete attention, without interrupting, and with an expression on his face that suggested he was actually hearing every word. "It must be difficult," he said, "managing the place when Emmett is on the drive." "I manage," she said, and then, because she was tired and the relief of the last hour had stripped away some of her customary caution, she said, "It is difficult when the pump freezes and the south fence line needs mending and there is no one to help with the heavier work, but I manage." He looked at her steadily. "When is the pump likely to give you trouble next?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The pump, you said it freezes." "Winter is a ways off yet, but in the meantime there may be other trouble with it. Have you had the leather seals replaced recently?" She had not, she admitted, because she was not entirely certain how to do that, and the man she had been paying to help with repairs had moved his family to Colorado in March. Gilbert Fletcher set down his coffee cup. "I could take a look at it before I head back," he said. "If you have a spare washer and some tallow, it is not a complicated job." She studied him for a moment across the table. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "you have already ridden 40 miles today as a favor to my brother. You do not need to fix my pump as well." "I know I don't need to," he said simply. "I would like to." She let him look at the pump. He was right that it was not complicated, and he was methodical and quiet about the work, and when he was finished, he washed his hands in the water barrel by the door and put his hat back on, and told her that he was staying at the boarding house in town that night before heading back to the drive in the morning. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, as he stepped off the porch into the last of the evening light, "thank you for everything." He paused at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back at her, and that expression was on his face again, the one she couldn't quite name. "It was my pleasure, Miss Grady," he said. Then he touched the brim of his hat, stepped into the saddle of the patient roan horse waiting at the hitching post, and rode away down the road toward Dusty Creek. She stood on the porch and watched him go, the wildflowers still in her hand. The sky was turning the deep orange and violet of a Kansas dusk, and the air smelled of cut grass and coming rain, and she thought that she should go inside and put the flowers in a jar of water before they wilted entirely. She did not move for a long moment, watching the dust settle where his horse had passed. It was 3 weeks before she saw Gilbert Fletcher again. He came on a Tuesday, which she would not have known except that she had just finished her weekly baking, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of bread and dried apple pie. He knocked at the door, that same steady, deliberate knock, and when she opened it, he was standing there in the morning light looking somewhat less dusty than the first time, with his hat in his hands and a slightly uncertain expression on his face that she found unexpectedly appealing. "Miss Grady," he said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are not," she said. "Come in." He explained, finished the drive to Abilene and collected his pay, and he had a few weeks before the Donahue outfit ran another herd north. He had come back through Dusty Creek because, and here he paused, and she watched him choose his words with the same careful attention he had given to the pump, because Emmett had mentioned that there was work to be done on the property and had asked him to help while he was free. "Emmett asked you," she said. "He did." She looked at him. "Did Emmett tell you to bring flowers again, too?" Something moved through Gilbert Fletcher's copper-brown eyes that might have been amusement. "No, ma'am. That was my own doing this time." She looked down and realized that he was, in fact, holding another small cluster of wildflowers. These ones different from the last batch, morning glories and prairie clover and what she thought might be wild bergamot gathered. It appeared from the road outside, their stems wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from what had probably been a bandana. She felt a warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the bread oven. "Mr. Fletcher," she said carefully, "I appreciate the gesture. But I want to be clear with you. I am not a woman who can be charmed with flowers and offers of labor." "I know that," he said, and his voice was steady and perfectly serious. "I'm not trying to charm you, Miss Grady. I'm trying to be a decent neighbor and a good friend to your brother. The flowers are because—" He paused, and she could see that he was being absolutely honest, choosing his words with precision because that was who he was. "The flowers are because you looked frightened when you opened the door last time, and I wished I had thought of something to do about that before I knocked. So this time I brought them first, so you would know right away that there was no bad news." Celia Grady looked at Gilbert Fletcher for a long, quiet moment, and something shifted in the architecture of her opinion of him. "Come in," she said. "I have bread just out of the oven." The weeks that followed were among the most unusual and quietly wonderful of Celia's life. Gilbert was, as she quickly discovered, a man of extraordinary usefulness and very few words, but the words he did use were always worth hearing. He mended the south fence line in 2 days. He replaced the rotting boards on the porch floor. He helped her move the heavy iron stove to better position so the chimney drew properly, a 2-person job that she had been putting off for months. He did all of this without being asked a second time for anything, and without suggesting by word or expression that she ought to be grateful, which she found she was anyway. In the evenings, when the light grew long and golden and the work of the day was done, they sat on the newly repaired porch and talked. Or rather, she talked, and he listened, and occasionally he said something that surprised her, a dry observation about the nature of cattle or Kansas weather, a question about something she had mentioned in passing that showed he had been paying closer attention than she realized. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had died when she was 12, about how she had learned to sew and cook, and also, quietly, to handle a rifle because her mother had believed that a woman who could not protect herself was a woman at someone else's mercy. He told her about Texas, about the years of working for various outfits and sleeping rough, and the particular loneliness of the trail that she could see lived in him like a quiet ache. "Do you ever want a place of your own?" she asked him one evening. "Land, I mean, something that doesn't move." He was quiet for a moment, looking out across her land in the fading light, the creek line visible in the distance as a dark stripe through the gold of the grass. "Yes," he said. "I have wanted that for a long time. I just have not yet figured out how to make it happen without someone to make it worth having." He was not looking at her when he said it, and she was glad, because she was not sure what her face did in that moment, and she would have liked to have more control over it than she did. There was a day in the second week when she came home from town to find that he had not only fixed the broken axle on the small wagon, but had also, apparently, gotten into a disagreement with a traveling man who had been making remarks about her to the proprietor of the dry goods store. She found out about this from Mrs. Clara Webb, who ran the boarding house and who told her with considerable relish that Gilbert Fletcher had walked into that store and told the man in question, quietly and without raising his voice, that there were certain things said about certain women that a decent person did not say, and that if the man found himself unable to stop saying those things, it might be best for his health if he moved on down the road. He did not threaten him, Mrs. Webb clarified, with the tone of someone who wished the story were slightly more dramatic. He was perfectly polite about it, which was somehow more frightening. Celia stood in the middle of Mrs. Webb's parlor and felt something bloom in her chest that was warm and fierce and slightly alarming. She did not say anything to Gilbert about it that evening. She waited until they had finished supper and cleared the plates, and then she stood at the sink and looked out the window at the last of the light and said, "I heard what you did at Harmon's store today." There was a silence behind her. "It was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing," she said. She turned around. He was still seated at the table, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, watching her with that steady, careful attention. It was "Thank you, Gilbert." It was the first time she had used his given name. She saw him notice it. She saw something change in his face, slow and careful as a sunrise. "You don't need me to fight your battles," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't, but it matters that you wanted to." They looked at each other across the kitchen in the fading light, and the air between them felt different than it had before, charged with something that had no name yet but was gathering itself into a shape. He left 2 days later for the Donahue outfit's next drive, a shorter run down toward the Indian Territory border. He told her 3 days before he left, which she appreciated, and on the morning of his departure he came to say goodbye. She stood on the porch and he stood at the bottom of the steps with his horse waiting, and he held his hat in both hands and looked up at her. "Miss Grady," he said. "Celia." "Gilbert," she said. "I would like—" He stopped. He tried again. "When I come back—" "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I haven't finished the question." "I know," she said. "Yes, anyway." That did something remarkable to his face. The seriousness didn't go away. She was beginning to understand that seriousness was simply the bedrock of who Gilbert Fletcher was, the quality beneath everything else. But something else came up through it, warm and a little wondering, and it changed the angles of his face into something that made her heart knock against her ribs. "I'll come back by the end of August," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He rode away down the road, and this time she noticed that he sat very straight in the saddle, and she thought that she was in a considerable amount of trouble. The summer moved through its long, hot weeks, and Celia worked her land and tended her kitchen garden and received 2 letters from Emmett, who was, characteristically, light on details and heavy on cheerful reassurance, and who mentioned in the second letter, almost as an aside, that Fletcher was a good man and she could trust him, which was, coming from Emmett, practically a formal endorsement. She also received in mid-July a letter that was not from Emmett, and that created a problem. The letter was from a man named Harlan Dodd, who represented a land investment company out of Wichita. The letter was very politely worded and very firm in its message, which was that the company had an interest in the creekfront portion of her property, had reason to believe that her land deed was filed improperly with the county, and that she might find it beneficial to discuss a settlement with their representative at her earliest convenience. Celia read the letter 3 times and then set it on the table and looked at it for a while, the way you look at something you know is going to require a great deal from you. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was also not naive. She had heard enough from other settlers to know that land companies with Wichita lawyers behind them were not in the habit of politely suggesting settlements unless they had means to compel them. She went to the county seat herself, riding the wagon the 16 miles to the land office, and spent an afternoon with a clerk named Mr. Purvis, who was thorough and kind and who found, after a considerable search through the records, that her deed was filed correctly, that the land had been properly claimed and registered, and that the Wichita Company's claim about improper filing was, in his careful professional opinion, nonsense. But Mr. Purvis also told her, in a lower voice, that a company like the one described in the letter had been pressuring several homesteaders in the county, and that while the law was on her side, the law was sometimes slow and expensive to invoke, and that she should be careful. She drove home in the afternoon heat and thought about all of this, and by the time she turned onto her road, she had decided what she was going to do. She was going to hire a lawyer, which would cost money she did not readily have, and she was going to write to Emmett, and she was going to keep her rifle cleaned and loaded, and her deed copy locked in the tin box under her floorboard where her mother used to keep her savings. She was not going to wait for Gilbert Fletcher to come back and do something about it for her. She was going to handle it herself. This was entirely in keeping with her character, and it was also the decision that led, indirectly, to the most frightening evening of that summer. Harlan Dodd's representative came to her door on a Thursday in early August, 2 weeks before the end of August when she expected Gilbert back. He was a man named Corcoran, with oiled hair and a suit that had cost more than her wagon, and he was polite in the way that a hammer is polite before it hits a nail. She stood in her doorway and told him that her deed was properly filed, that she had documentation confirming this, and that she had retained the services of a lawyer in the county seat, which was not quite true yet, but would be as soon as she could arrange payment. Corcoran smiled and said that she might want to reconsider the expense, and suggested, with great politeness, that accidents had a way of happening to properties that were poorly maintained. Celia looked at him steadily. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Corcoran?" "I am offering you advice," he said pleasantly, and tipped his hat and rode away. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen for a while, and then she did something she had not done in quite some time. She went to the shelf above the fireplace and lifted down the photograph of her mother, a small daguerreotype in a tin frame, and she looked at her mother's face, that steady, sharp face that she had inherited in full, and she said quietly, "I am not moving." The following Tuesday, Gilbert Fletcher came back 2 weeks early. She heard the horse on the road before she saw it, and when she looked out the window and recognized the roan, something in her chest that had been working very hard to stay calm for the past 3 weeks simply released its grip. She was at the door before he had finished tying the horse. He looked up when the door opened, and his face, she had been trying to remember his face, had found it difficult in the way that faces are always harder to hold in memory than you expect, was tanned deeper now from the summer sun, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, but those copper-brown eyes were the same, and the way they landed on her was the same, with that quality of complete attention that she had never found in anyone else. "You are early," she said. "I heard something on the trail," he said, and his voice had a quality to it that she had not heard before, tightly controlled, like a horse that wants to run and is being held to a walk. "About a man named Corcoran, and a land company, and your property." She paused. "How did you hear about that?" "Emmett. He heard it from a drover who came through from Dusty Creek 2 weeks ago. I left the drive as soon as I could." He was at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at her, and his hat was in his hands. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said. "Celia." "I am," she said, and then she said, "I was frightened. For a little while, not any more." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him registering this, weighing it. "You were handling it yourself," he said. "It was not a question." "I was," she said. "I had the deed verified at the county office. I was arranging a lawyer." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I know a man in Wichita, a lawyer named Bartlett, who has dealt with this particular land company before. He has won twice against them in the district court. He knows their tactics." She stared at him. "How do you know a Wichita lawyer?" "He is the brother of a man I rode with for 2 years in Texas," Gilbert said simply. "I can write to him, if you'd like. He would not charge you full fee as a favor to me." She looked at him for a long moment in the August morning light, this man who had come back 2 weeks early from a paying job because he had heard she was in trouble, who was standing at her door with his hat in his hands, offering her not rescue but a resource, not charity but a connection. "Yes," she said. "Please write to him." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. I have biscuits." They sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter together, Celia drafting the details of the situation, while Gilbert added the necessary particulars about Bartlett's connection to the case. And it was the most companionable and somehow the most intimate thing she could remember doing in years. Sitting side by side at that table with their heads bent over the paper, and the morning light coming through the east window, and the smell of biscuits and coffee in the air. When the letter was finished and sealed, Gilbert sat back in his chair and looked at her with a directness that made her set down her coffee cup. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I know that we have not, that it has been a short time, and that I do not have a great deal to offer at the moment. I have my horse and my pay from the drive and some savings, and the intention of having my own land before another year is out. I know that is not much." "Gilbert, I am not finished," he said, and she subsided. He was looking at her steadily, and she realized that this was costing him something, this speech, that it was being assembled carefully from parts he had been working on for some time. "I have been on the trail most of my life. I have not been in the way of caring deeply about a place or a person before, not since I was very young. I thought it was simply not in my nature." He paused. "I was wrong about that." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass. "I think about you," he said plainly. "When I am on the trail, I think about you. I think about this land and this porch and the way you stood in the doorway the first time I knocked and looked so brave when you were so frightened, and He stopped. He looked down at his hands on the table. "I wanted to ask whether there was any possibility that you might be open to, that you might consider me as someone—" "Gilbert," she said. He looked up. "Yes," she said for the second time. "Yes, I would consider you." Something moved across his face that was large and warm and entirely unguarded, and in that moment he looked younger and more purely himself than she had yet seen him, and she thought that this was something she would like to see more of. "I have not done this before," he said. "Properly. I want to do it properly." "So do I," she said. "We will figure it out together." He smiled then. It was not an enormous smile. He was not, and she was already learning this, a man of enormous gestures. But it was absolutely real, and it reached all the way to those copper-brown eyes, and it made her feel warm from her throat to her heels. The lawyer Bartlett replied within 2 weeks. His letter was thorough and brisk and very good news. He had, as it happened, been building a case against the Harlan Dodd Land Company for more than a year, gathering complaints from multiple homesteaders in the region who had received similar letters and visits. Celia's documentation was exactly the kind of additional evidence he had been looking for, and if she was willing to be part of the larger action, he believed he could resolve the matter in her favor and in the favor of several other families simultaneously, with a much stronger legal standing than any individual case could achieve. She wrote back that she was willing. Emmett came home from the drive in late August, brown as leather and impossibly cheerful, and his reaction to finding Gilbert Fletcher sitting at his sister's kitchen table helping her review the legal correspondence with Bartlett was to look between the two of them with an expression of enormous satisfaction and say, "Well, it took you long enough." "Emmett," Celia said warningly. "I am just saying," Emmett said, helping himself to a biscuit, "that some people take the scenic route to the obvious destination." He looked at Gilbert. "You treating her right?" "I am trying to," Gilbert said. "He is," Celia said. Emmett nodded and ate his biscuit and said nothing further on the subject, but she caught him smiling to himself later that evening when he thought no one was looking, and she felt a rush of affection for him so strong it nearly made her laugh. The autumn came in slow and golden, the way Kansas autumns do, with long amber afternoons and the smell of harvest in the air, and the grass on the prairie going from green to gold to the deep russet of dried blood. Gilbert had taken on work with a local rancher named Hooper to stay in the area through the season, and he came to the homestead on his days off, and sometimes he stayed for supper. And the three of them, Celia and Gilbert and Emmett, fell into the kind of easy, comfortable pattern that she had not known since before her father died, since before she had been the practical one, the careful one, the one who made sure everything was all right. She and Gilbert took long walks in the evenings along the creek bank, where the cottonwood leaves were turning yellow and falling into the dark water. He told her things on those walks that she suspected he had not told many people, about a younger brother lost to fever in Texas when Gilbert was 19, about the way the trail could make you feel like you had no fixed point in the world, like you were just moving through everything without leaving a mark. She told him about the years after her father died, the particular weight of watching her mother work herself thin trying to hold everything together, about how she had promised herself she would never be in a position of having to wait for someone to save her from anything. "I know that," he said quietly. They were stopped at the edge of the creek, watching the water run dark under the cottonwoods. "I have never wanted to be something you needed saving from. You are not," she said. "You are something entirely different." He looked at her, and the last of the afternoon light was in his eyes. "What am I?" he asked. She thought about it seriously. The way he had taught her he appreciated, because he was always serious himself even when he was gentle. "You are someone who brings flowers before the bad news, so that I know there is no bad news," she said. "You are someone who fixes the pump without being asked and writes letters to lawyers and comes back 2 weeks early from a paying job because you heard I might be in trouble. You are," she paused, "you are someone I trust, entirely, and that is not a small thing." He was very still. Then slowly, he reached out and took her hand, just held it, his large work-roughened hand wrapped around hers, and they stood by the creek in the autumn light, and she listened to the water and thought that she had not been this at peace in as long as she could remember. He kissed her for the first time in October, at the end of a Sunday afternoon, when the light was doing extraordinary things through the kitchen window, and she had been telling him about the letter she'd received from Bartlett saying the legal case was proceeding well, and she had turned from the window to find him very close, looking at her with that copper-warm attention, and it was the most natural thing in the world to simply close the remaining space between them. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was quiet and certain and thorough. The way everything Gilbert Fletcher did was quiet and certain and thorough, and when it ended she stood in the kitchen light with her hands against his chest and her heart going at a considerable rate and thought that she was entirely done for. "Celia," he said, against her hair. "Yes," she said, for the third time in their acquaintance, and she felt him laugh just slightly, a low warm sound in his chest. He proposed to her in November, on the porch, on a cold, clear evening when the stars were out in their thousands, and the frost was sharp and clean in the air. He had clearly been planning it, because he was wearing his best shirt under his coat, and he had thought out what he wanted to say, which was that he loved her, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life on a piece of land with her, and that he understood she was not a woman who needed a man to complete her life, but that he hoped she might want him in it anyway, and that he promised to always bring the flowers before the news so she would know from the start how the visit was going to go. She laughed at that last part, and the laughter caught in her throat and turned into something else, and she said yes with her hands on either side of his face, and the frost sparkling in the air around them, and the Kansas stars blazing overhead. They were married in December of 1878 in the small Dusty Creek church, on a day when the sky was a brilliant winter blue, and the ground was lightly frosted, and Mrs. Clara Webb from the boarding house cried even though she had only known them a handful of months. Emmett stood up with Gilbert, which Emmett said was the best decision anyone had made since someone decided to put doors on houses. The minister was a kind man named Reverend Cross, who kept the ceremony simple and sincere, which was exactly what they both wanted. Celia wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself from fabric ordered from a catalog, and she carried a small arrangement of dried wildflowers that she had pressed and saved from the creek bank bundles that Gilbert had brought her, from the very first visit to the most recent, kept in a tin between layers of paper on the shelf above the fireplace. When Gilbert saw them, something moved through his face that was so completely unguarded that she felt she was seeing the very center of him, the place that the trail and the years of moving and the losses had never quite managed to reach. "You kept them," he said. "Every one," she said. The reception was modest and warm. Emmett made a toast that was heartfelt and only slightly embarrassing. Mrs. Webb had brought apple cake and dried cherry preserves. The rancher Hooper and his wife had come, and a few families from neighboring homesteads, and the lawyer Bartlett had sent a congratulatory letter that arrived the week before the wedding, along with the news that the case against the Harlan Dodd Land Company had been settled in favor of the plaintiffs. Every one of the homesteaders who had joined the action, including Celia, would retain their properties without contest, and the company had been ordered by the district court to cease its fraudulent claims in the county. Celia had read that letter out loud at the kitchen table to Gilbert and Emmett, and when she finished there had been a moment of silence, and then Emmett had whooped loudly enough to startle the cat off the windowsill, and Gilbert had simply put his hand over hers on the table and pressed once, warm and steady. The winter was a good one, as Kansas winters go, which is to say it was hard but manageable, and they were warm in the house and well stocked from the harvest, and there was the particular pleasure of being newly married in a place that felt like home. Gilbert had sold some of his trail savings and put it with what Celia had from the property, and together they had purchased the adjacent 40 acres when it came available in January, expanding the homestead significantly and giving them enough land to run a proper small cattle operation alongside the existing farm. Emmett was talking about going north to Montana in the spring, which Celia thought was almost certainly going to happen, and which she felt about in the complex way you feel about a person you love deeply doing the thing that is most entirely like them. She would miss him terribly. She also knew he would come back, and probably come back with stories large enough to fill 3 winters. February brought a snowstorm that lasted 4 days and blanketed everything in a deep, profound white silence. They were snowed in, which meant they talked more than they had in the busy months before, and played cards and read aloud by the fire, and argued pleasantly about small things and made up again with considerably more pleasantness. She learned that Gilbert had a good memory for poetry, particularly for certain verses from Longfellow and Whitman that he had read by firelight on lonely trail camps and apparently retained without particularly meaning to. She read them to him sometimes in the evenings, and he would sometimes correct her quietly if she missed a word, and she found this charming in a way she would have found surprising in someone else. She learned that he could not carry a tune to save his life, which he was aware of and found privately funny. She learned that he was deeply patient with almost everything, but found dishonesty genuinely difficult to tolerate, not in a harsh or punishing way, but in the way of a man who had organized his entire life around trying to be honest about everything, including himself, and who found dishonesty in others therefore somewhat baffling. She learned that he slept lightly and always woke first and usually had the coffee going before she was dressed, and that he did this without comment or expectation of notice, simply because it was something he could do and it would please her, and she found that this quality of doing kindness quietly, without accounting for it, was one of the qualities she loved most in him. March came in muddy and difficult. The cattle needed managing in the spring thaw, and Gilbert worked long days, and she worked long days alongside him, and there were evenings when they were both too tired for conversation and just sat on the repaired porch, her porch, which was also now his porch, which was now their porch, and watched the prairie come alive in the spring dark with the songs of frogs and owls and the distant lowing of restless cattle. In March she also told him that she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning when he was lacing his boots and she was standing at the stove, and the words came out more abruptly than she had planned because she had been planning them for a week, and by the time she said them she had simply run out of planning capacity. He looked up from his boots. He stared at her. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He stood up from the chair and crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her face in his hands, his big careful hands, and looked at her with an expression she had no adequate name for. It was beyond happiness, beyond the simple word love. It was something more like awe, like the expression of a man who has wanted something for so long that its arrival does not feel entirely real. "Celia," he said. "Yes," she said quietly. He pulled her close and held her carefully, like she was something precious, and she could feel the beat of his heart against her cheek, and outside the kitchen window the March wind was moving through the new grass, and she thought that if she could hold one moment perfectly still forever in her life, it might be this one. Emmett departed for Montana in April, which he had announced he would do and then did, which was also entirely characteristic. He hugged Celia on the porch. She was just beginning to show, just barely, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was so much older than his usual cheerful demeanor that she felt a sudden sharp sense of how much growing up the two of them had done side by side without quite noticing. "You are the best thing I have managed in my life," he said, "and I am not talking about the property." "Emmett," she said. "I am talking about you," he said, "finding you a good man. That is the best thing I did." "You did very little," she said, but her voice was not entirely steady. "I sent him with flowers," Emmett said and grinned, and stepped off the porch and mounted his horse before she could say anything else, and rode away north in the April morning with his hat pushed back on his head, waving over his shoulder without turning around. Gilbert put his arm around her shoulders as they watched him go. She leaned into him. "He will be back," Gilbert said. "He will," she agreed. "He cannot resist coming back to see what sort of trouble I am up to." The spring and summer of 1879 were full and warm and rich in the particular way that a year can be rich when you are building something and can see it taking shape around you. The expanded land was producing well. The cattle were healthy. The kitchen garden was the best she had grown yet, partly because Gilbert had spent time in April improving the drainage around it, which she had been meaning to address for 2 years. They had neighbors now in a way they had not before, people who had been through the land company trouble alongside them, who had become allies and then friends, who came by and were come by in turn. There was a family named Tanner who had the property a mile south, with a daughter named Ruth and a son named James who was 12 and already desperately in love with cattle in the way that 12-year-old boys can be devoted to cattle. There was old Mr. Whitfield, who had been farming the high prairie ground for 20 years and who knew everything about the land and the weather, and told it all to whoever would listen in a slow, deliberate way that was either fascinating or tedious depending on how much time you had. Dusty Creek itself was growing. A new general store had opened alongside Harmon's Dry Goods. There was talk of a school, which Celia thought was one of the more meaningful signs of a town deciding to be a town rather than just a stop along a road. She had been asked to serve on the committee discussing the school because she could read and write thoroughly and had opinions about education, and she did so, and found it satisfying in a way that made her realize she had been missing this kind of community involvement without quite knowing it. Gilbert accompanied her to the committee meetings when he could and sat with his hat in his hands in the back of the room and said very little. But afterward, on the ride home, he was always full of quiet observations about what had been said and what it meant for the town, and she came to value those observations considerably. Their son was born in September of 1879 in the house, with the help of Mrs. Tanner and the town's doctor, who arrived somewhat breathlessly after a hard ride from the county seat. The birth was long and difficult, the hardest thing Celia had ever done, and she said so in a very clear voice during several hours of it, and the doctor told her she was doing admirably, and Mrs. Tanner held her hand and said firmly that she was doing beautifully, and that it would be worth it, which it was. Gilbert had been in the front room for most of the hours of labor, which was where the doctor had firmly sent him, and when the doctor came out and told him he had a son, She heard from the bedroom the particular quality of the silence that followed, the silence of a man absorbing news that has changed the world he was standing in. He came in when they brought him in, and he stood at the side of the bed and looked at the child in her arms, a small, tremendously determined-looking person with a great deal of dark hair and absolutely no patience for being cold, making his feelings known clearly. And then he looked at Celia, and his face was completely open, wide open like a door off its hinges. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very tired," she said, "and very much all right." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time with those big, careful, work-roughened hands. And the look on his face was the one she had been trying to find words for since the first evening she had seen it, that quality of awe of something being more real than expected, of a man who had not allowed himself to fully believe in something until it was in his hands. "What do we name him?" she asked. He looked up. "You should choose." "We should choose together," she said. They had talked about names in the summer idly without settling on anything. She had liked the name James, but Emmett had preemptively claimed it as his future firstborn's name, apparently, which was presumptuous but very Emmett. Gilbert had said once that he had always liked the name Hale, which had been his mother's family name, and she had filed this away. "Hale," she said now. "Hale Fletcher, if you would like." The look on his face answered for him. Hale Fletcher was a determined, lively, robust child who developed opinions early and expressed them at volume, which Celia felt was entirely appropriate given his heritage from both sides. He slept in a cradle that Gilbert had made through the winter months from good cedar wood, working at it in the evenings when the weather was too cold for outdoor work, fitting the joints together with the same careful precision he brought to every physical task, sanding the wood smooth with a patience that she found continually remarkable. The letter from Emmett came in November, from somewhere in the Montana Territory, and was full of mountains and adventure, and a completely implausible story about a grizzly bear that she did not believe for a second, but read to Gilbert twice, because it was very entertaining. Emmett reported that Montana was grand and cold, and that he was working for a ranch operation near the Yellowstone River, and that he was very well. He asked about the baby, having received her earlier letter, and said that the name Hale was a solid choice, and that he expected the child to be enormous and difficult, which was a fine thing to be. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the coldest in recent memory. The kind of cold that is not merely inconvenient but structural, that gets into the walls of a house and into the joints of your hands and makes every task take twice as long. The pump froze, and Gilbert thought it with care, using techniques that he had developed now over 2 winters of managing this particular pump on this particular property. The cattle required constant management. The road to town was impassable for 2 weeks in January. But the house was warm with the wood they had cut in autumn, and the baby grew at the extraordinary rate that babies grow, and they were warm at night, and the days had the particular intensity of 2 people who have built something together in hard conditions and know the value of what they have made. There was an evening in February of 1880 when the cold outside was severe enough to make the windows creak, and Hale was asleep in his cradle, and the fire was doing its work, and Celia was sitting in the chair by the fire with a piece of mending, and Gilbert was on the other chair reading. He read considerably, which she loved, and had sent away to Wichita for books that came wrapped in paper and string and were opened with the pleasure of gifts, and she looked across the room at him in the firelight. This man who had knocked on her door a year and a half ago with Wildflowers in his hand, this man who had come back from a drive early because he heard she might be in trouble, this man who had proposed to her on a frosty porch under Kansas stars, who had made a cradle with careful hands and held his son with those same hands like something irreplaceable. "Gilbert," she said. He looked up from his book. "I love you," she said. "I do not say it enough. I want to say it." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the firelight move across his face, and he said, "You say it every day, Celia, in every possible way other than words." "I know," she said. "I also want to say the words." He put down his book. He got up from his chair and crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair so that his face was level with hers, and he took her hands in his, and he looked at her in the way that still, after a year and a half, made her feel like she was the only fixed point in his world. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the moment I understood what you meant when you said you managed, and I understood that you had been managing alone for a very long time, and I wanted with everything I had to be someone who made that easier. Not because I thought you needed it, because I wanted to give it." She brought his hands up and pressed them against her cheek and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of them. "You do," she said. "You do make it easier." Spring came, and the land came back to life, and the cattle were healthy, and the expanded acreage was producing, and the Dusty Creek School opened in April, in a new one-room building that the town had built through collective labor over the previous winter. Celia was one of the founding committee members, and she was there for the first day, standing in the April sunshine outside the new building with the other founding committee members and the first 15 students and their families. And she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing accomplished that will outlast the accomplishment. Gilbert stood next to her with Hale on his arm. Their son had developed a strong preference for this vantage point and could be counted on to observe the world from there with great seriousness, and he said quietly, "Your mother would have been proud of this." She felt that in her chest. "Yes," she said, "she would have." The summer brought Emmett back, which was a tremendous surprise and a tremendous relief, and a tremendous disruption of the household routine, which Emmett managed in his cheerful, destructive way by simply arriving without notice and expecting everything to be exactly as he had left it, except for the baby, whom he regarded with enormous fascination, and immediately named Hale, the sheriff, on the grounds that the child had the demeanor of a person who expected compliance. Emmett had come back from Montana with a plan, which was unusual for Emmett, and with enough money to execute it, which was more unusual still. He intended to stake his own land claim, north of Celia and Gilbert's property, on the creek bend that had come available with the resolution of the land company matter. He would run a small horse operation. He had learned a great deal about horses in Montana, he said, and Celia could tell from his manner when he talked about the horses that he had found the thing he was meant to do, and she loved him for it. He stayed through the summer and into the autumn, building his own house on the new claim with help from Gilbert and from the Tanner family, and from old Mr. Whitfield, who could not do the heavy lifting, but could direct it with great authority. Emmett's house was smaller and rougher than Celia and Gilbert's house, but it was solid, and by September of 1880 it was finished, and Emmett moved in with his horses and his stories and his considerable personality, and Celia found that having him that close but not in her house was an ideal arrangement. The years from 1880 to 1883 were the building years, the years that she would look back on as the period when the life she and Gilbert had imagined for themselves became completely, solidly real. The cattle operation grew steadily. Gilbert had a talent for management that she suspected had always been there, underneath the years of working for other people's outfits, and when it was directed at something that was his own, it flourished in a way that was gratifying to watch. She ran the household and contributed to the school committee and delivered babies as an informal assistant to the doctor on 3 occasions, which led to a more formal arrangement where she became something closer to a proper midwife, learning what the doctor could teach her and practicing with a care and seriousness that he respected. She found the work deeply meaningful. There was something about being present at the beginning of a life that connected directly to the part of her that had always been most strongly herself. In the autumn of 1881, their daughter was born, and this time the birth was faster, if not easier, and the doctor said that she was an expert patient, which she suspected was doctor language for efficient. The girl was small and fierce, with Gilbert's copper-colored eyes and Celia's dark hair, and they named her Marin, which was a name Celia had carried since childhood from a story her mother used to tell. Marin Fletcher was the complete delight of everyone who encountered her, including Gilbert, who was not, as a general rule, a man of demonstrative emotion, but who sat with his daughter in the rocking chair on the porch for long, quiet evening hours with an expression of complete and unconditional love that Celia would see in her mind for the rest of her life, whenever she thought about what happiness looked like. Hale, who had been the center of the world for 2 years and was now 3, regarded his sister with the complex ambivalence of a small person who is not sure if this new arrival is a threat or a gift, and settled eventually into a protective older brother role that was so emphatic it was sometimes inconvenient. The legal trouble with the Harlan Dodd Land Company was fully resolved by the spring of 1882, when the district court finalized the judgment and the company dissolved. Several of the homesteaders who had been part of the action received small compensatory payments for the harassment and legal costs they had incurred, and while Celia's was not large, she used it to purchase a proper bookshelf for the school library, which the committee had been trying to fund for a year, and she did so anonymously and enjoyed knowing that it was there. Emmett's horse operation was a genuine success, which pleased her enormously and surprised precisely no one who knew him well. He had a gift for horses in the way that some people have gifts for music or mathematics. It was native to him, immediately apparent in the way he moved around them, and the animals responded to him with a trust that even old Mr. Whitfield, who had been watching men and horses for 50 years, called something special. He was doing well, and he was happy, and he had also, she noticed in the summer of 1882, begun to spend a considerable amount of time at the Tanner farm. Ruth Tanner was 20, and Emmett was 28, and the age difference was comfortable, and the compatibility was apparent to everyone in Dusty Creek before it was apparent to either of them, which was a situation that Celia enjoyed observing with great interest. She said nothing to Emmett for a long time. Then, one evening when he was helping her shell beans on the porch and Gilbert was in the barn and the children were asleep, she said, "Ruth Tanner has a very good head on her shoulders." Emmett shelled beans for a moment. "She does," he said carefully. "And she is kind," Celia said. "And she is practical, and she has a sharp sense of humor, and she is not impressed by stories, which I think would be very healthy for you." "Celia," Emmett said. "I am just observing," she said. There was a long pause. "I do not know how to do this properly," Emmett said, and his voice was different from his usual voice, quieter, less certain. "You and Gilbert made it look straightforward, but I think I am not sure I do not want to make a mess of it." Celia set down her beans and looked at her brother. He was the same Emmett who had laughed at everything, who had gone to Montana and come back with stories, who had built his own house and found his own work and made himself into a man, and he was also, in this moment, completely young and completely uncertain, and she loved him for it. "Emmett," she said gently, "you went to the Cimarron crossing and you sent a man 40 miles with Wildflowers because you knew I was worrying. That is the kind of person you are. Go be that person with Ruth Tanner and you will not make a mess of it." He was quiet for a moment, then he smiled, slow and genuine. "You are insufferable," he said. "I know," she said. He married Ruth Tanner in the spring of 1883, and it was a fine wedding, and Ruth wore a dress of pale yellow, and Emmett wore his best clothes and stood up straight for the entirety of the ceremony, which Celia considered a genuine triumph of effort on his part. By the spring of 1884, Dusty Creek was a proper town with a proper school and 2 churches, and a doctor's office that was open 3 days a week, and a weekly newspaper that ran 4 pages and was read by everyone. And it was a different place from the rough stop on the road that Celia had first seen 6 years ago, and she felt the change in her bones, the particular satisfaction of having been part of something becoming itself. Gilbert Fletcher had a reputation in the county by now as an honest man and a capable farmer and stockman, which were the 2 most important things to have a reputation for in that time and place, and he was asked occasionally to consult on disputes between neighbors, which he did with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. He was not a man who sought prominence, but prominence found him anyway, in the modest, practical form of a community that trusted his judgment. Hale was 5 and Marin was 3, and they were, between them, a sufficient source of noise and activity, and wonder to fill any house several times over. Hale had developed a passion for horses that made Emmett's eyes light up with recognition, and he spent long Saturday afternoons at Emmett's place learning which horses could be trusted, and how to approach them, and how to read their moods. And Emmett was a patient teacher in a way that Celia had not expected, and that touched her deeply. Marin had opinions about everything, and expressed them clearly in her mother's voice and her father's careful, complete sentences, which was a combination that was both tremendously appealing and occasionally exhausting. She had also taken a serious interest in the flowers that grew along the creek bank, and could name 6 varieties by the time she was 3½ taught partly by Gilbert and partly by the sheer force of her own determined attention. There was an afternoon in the late summer of 1884 when Celia was in the garden and Gilbert came out of the house with Marin in his arms, and he had a bunch of wildflowers in his other hand, creek bank flowers, the same kind he had brought the very first time, black-eyed Susans and yarrow and purple clover, and he crossed the garden to where she was kneeling in the soil, and he held them out to her. She looked up at him, squinting in the afternoon light. "Good news or just flowers?" she said. He smiled. "Just flowers," he said. "Marin found them. She wanted to give them to you." Marin reached out from her father's arms toward her mother with the wildflowers gripped in her small fist, her copper-brown eyes bright and pleased. Celia took the flowers and took her daughter and stood up, and Gilbert put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the garden in the afternoon sun with Marin chattering about the names of the flowers between them, and the sound of Hale's voice came from the direction of Emmett's property, clear in the summer air, and the smell of the garden and the grass and the creek was everywhere. And the house behind them was solid and real and full of the accumulated weight of years of good work and hard weather and love that had been built patiently, carefully, like everything Gilbert Fletcher built, piece by piece into something that would hold. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, "about the night you first knocked." He looked down at her. "What about it?" "I was so certain the news was bad," she said. "I stood at that door and I was so certain. And there you were with your ridiculous armful of wildflowers that Emmett had made you carry 40 miles, looking like you would rather be anywhere else." "I was not uncomfortable," he said. "You were absolutely uncomfortable," she said, laughing. "You held them like they were something that might bite you." "I was not certain of the reception," he said with dignity. "You were not certain of the reception," she repeated, smiling. "And then you told me there was no bad news and you fixed my pump. Someone needed to." "Someone did," she said, "and I thought as you rode away that I was in trouble." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you right?" he asked. She looked at her daughter, who had started listing the flowers she knew in a determined voice, and she looked out across the land that was theirs, the creek lined dark through the autumn gold grass, the evening sky beginning its slow burn over the western horizon. And she thought about all the evenings she had watched that sky from this porch, and how different they were now from those first careful evenings, when she had not yet known what was being built. "Yes," she said, "the best kind." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she leaned into him, and Marin leaned out of her arms to show Gilbert the black-eyed Susans again, because she was not satisfied with the level of enthusiasm she had received so far, and he solemnly agreed that they were very fine flowers. And the evening came down over the Kansas prairie in great warm bands of orange and gold, and the stars, when they appeared, were brilliant and clear and countless, the way they had been on the night he proposed, and the night of their wedding, and every night that had mattered. And Celia Grady Fletcher stood on the porch of her home with her husband and her daughter and her whole solid life arranged around her, and thought that she would not change a single thing, not the door she had opened in fear, not the man on the other side of it, not the wildflowers in his hand. Emmett rode over that evening with Ruth, who was expecting their first child in the winter, her face bright and calm in the way of women who have made their peace with the enormity of what is coming. They stayed for supper, and the table was full and loud and warm. And afterward the men sat on the porch while Celia and Ruth sat in the kitchen and talked in the easy, intimate way of women who trust each other. About the baby coming and about what Dusty Creek was turning into, and about whether the school needed a second teacher now that enrollment had grown to 40 children, which Celia thought it certainly did, and which she intended to bring to the committee next week. Hale fell asleep on the floor by the fireplace before the evening was half done, worn out from his day at Emmett's, and Gilbert carried him to bed without waking him and came back and sat down across from Emmett on the porch. And they talked about the cattle and the coming season, and the new fencing Emmett wanted along the north boundary. And the conversation moved in the comfortable, unhurried way of men who have nothing to prove to each other. Through the kitchen window, Celia could hear their voices, low and steady, and Ruth was saying something about the name they were considering for the baby. A boy name, she thought. She had a feeling. And outside the stars were doing their brilliant work, and the creek was running dark and silver through the grass, and Dusty Creek was asleep in its own warm lights a mile down the road, and everything was exactly, precisely, completely as it should be. She had been 24 years old when she stood at that door in the dusk, her hand gripping the frame, her heart preparing itself for the worst. She was 30 now, and the worst had not come, and the best had come instead, in the form of a serious-faced cowboy with wildflowers held awkwardly against his duster and copper-brown eyes, and a voice like a road that had been traveled hard, and she had built something with him that was real and solid and warm and would last. She had thought he was bringing bad news. He had been bringing something else entirely. She went to the kitchen door and looked out at the porch where Gilbert was sitting, and he turned his head in that way he had, always aware of where she was, always paying that specific attention, and his eyes found hers across the porch in the lamplight, and he smiled at her, quiet and certain and real. "Ruth's staying for pie," she said. "Good," he said. "Are you going to tell Emmett to stop talking about the north fence long enough to come inside and eat it?" Gilbert turned to Emmett. "Emmett," he said. "I heard her," Emmett said. She laughed and went back into the kitchen. And the house was warm and full of the people she loved and the life she had built and the years still ahead. And Gilbert Fletcher came inside 5 minutes later and sat at the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the cloth, and pressed once, warm and steady, the way he always had. And the Kansas night settled over the prairie, over the creek and the cattle and the homestead and the town, over the school and the new church and old Mr. Whitfield's place and the Tanner farm, over everything that had been built from raw land and hard work, and the particular human stubbornness that says this is mine and I will not be moved from it. And the stars were brilliant, and the air was clean. And in the morning there would be work to do. There was always work to do. But for now there was pie and lamplight and the sound of voices and laughter, and Celia Fletcher sat at her table in the home she had made and was wholly, entirely, completely content. It had started with a knock at the door. It had started with a man holding wildflowers, and the worst news she had never received, and the best thing she had not yet seen coming. It had started in the dusk with her heart braced for grief and had arrived here, at this table, at this life, in this particular warmth that had no adequate name except the one that had been sufficient from the beginning. It was enough. It was, in every possible way, more than enough.